Welcome to Globewatch with me, Charles Ebune. I am airing today from the office of the United Nations Development Program here in Yaoundé, Cameroon. Tonight, we start with an apology. We are very sorry that for the past 15 years, we have been unable collectively to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, which was an ambitious 8-point global agenda to halve global poverty by 50% by 2015. And that is why we are elaborating a new set of an agenda of 17 goals, simply named Sustainable Development Goals, to be achieved by 2030. So, how do we draw the lines and differences between an 8-point global agenda and a 17-point global agenda, all expected to be achieved within the same time frame of 15 years? Najat Rochdi, thanks very much for accepting our invitation on Globewatch once more.
Thank you very much, Charles, for the opportunity once more.
Let me start with a question that journalists don't often ask to policymakers like you. What went right with the Millennium Development Goals?
Well, you know what went right actually about the Millennium Development Goals. It was the first time ever, actually, the international community, all the countries in the world, regardless of their level of development or richness or poverty, actually agreed on common goals. And that's really a unique moment. It was a unique moment. So I would say that it was a very strong tool for advocacy, but also to influence the policy dialogue, but also the policy making, in order to address, let's say, common objectives, but also common values.
Oh, quantitatively, what can we boast of after elaborating 8 goals spanning 10 years of achievement? Quantitatively, are there any significant areas of progress?
You know, globally, I mean, it's very different from a country to another, obviously. But we can say that globally, actually, if you just take the average or quantitative assessment, yes, we can say that the goals have been more or less achieved, but the 8th goal, which is about the global partnership. But when you get into details and try to assess that country by country, obviously there are very important gaps between countries. And if we are, for example, coming back to Cameroon, I can tell you that for goal 1, it was achieved when it comes to education for little girls and trying to have more equity in terms of access to education between girls and boys. The country has really achieved a lot. But unfortunately, the country is really lagging behind when it comes to most of the other MDGs.
Let's look at the goals from a global perspective. We talk of having poverty by 50%. We talk of achieving universal primary education. We talk of having a world where gender equality was a primordial role to play in society. For the past 10 years, how many people have we moved in poverty? How many people have we moved to a better educational level? How did we sustain the environment?
Well, in terms of poverty, actually, when you take the global indicator, actually it went beyond having poverty of the world. What you have to keep in mind is that by that time we were not talking about the 7 billion people we have today, but rather about 3 billion, if I'm not mistaken, by that time.
4 to 5 billion people.
4 billion, so definitely there are 2 billion people who were left out of poverty. In terms of access to girls as well, I mean, you can think that 20% of this figure have been able really to access to education. In terms, for example, I mean, a lot of questions this year are around 70 years of existence of United Nations, actually, and we all believe that the September 2000 and the MDG commitment was really a turning point in terms of addressing in a measurable way, concrete actions in bettering the conditions of lives. Of course, in terms of environment, there are new challenges. Climate change was not really an issue in 2000. It was more about preservation of the forest and preservation of natural resources. So all the efforts were really directed toward a better management, a better governance, and making sure that whatever outcomes and benefit of those natural resources would be equitably distributed to the population and the communities.
Let me ask a question that journalists will generally ask. For the past years, we agreed to universal health care for everybody and whatsoever other Millennium Development Goals. But concretely, from a global perspective, none of those goals was achieved completely. What went wrong?
I think what went wrong in the beginning, and that's also what is the value added of the SDGs, and the difference with the SDGs was that it was very much, up-bottom kind of strategies and recommendations, where actually the MDGs were not formulated in a participatory approach, and therefore civil society did not have a voice, the youth groups did not have a voice, vulnerable groups did not have a voice, and therefore it expressed actually what the world at that time thought was really what needed to be addressed in terms of priorities for development. The second thing, and that's our lesson learned from the MDGs, it was a very much sectorial approach, and obviously, given all the conflicts we see today, we see that the development gains are very fragile at the end of the day. And if ever we don't have peace and stability and security, this is completely jeopardizing all the efforts. And therefore, some missing, layers in the MDGs led to, the gaps in terms of achievement. And that's why, for example, in the SDGs, we consider that peace, security,
you just spoke of missing layers. Was the UN unrealistic in elaborating them? Or did the UN chew more than what it could swallow, as an ordinary man would say it?
Well, just as a clarification, MDGs were not formulated by UN. MDGs were formulated by the member states. It was a UN setup, but
which was an embodiment of that.
It was governments with the UN. What I can say is that not taking into account the voice of the field, yes, that was missing, and therefore the planning and the prediction actually were not as accurate as it should be. What we could not predict also is really the kind of conflicts and the kind of fundamentalism and violence we see since the past 10 years, and that nobody could really predict.
Okay. From Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, which are, of course, a 17-point package for the next 15 years. Can you prioritize the new set of goals, Sustainable Development Goals? If you had to pick the most essentials, which one will be the first?
I will definitely not do that, because actually each country, and that's also a difference, and it's very important difference, and as UN we really welcome that. Actually, there will be a localization of those goals according to the priorities of each country. In a country like Cameroon, for example, water will be really a high access to water, sanitation, hygiene will be a very high priority, and education will be a high priority. Well, maybe in other countries, ocean will be a high priority. So there is no size fit it all. So that's really the principle of the SDGs. The second very important principle of the SDGs, again compared to the MDGs, is really this comprehensive approach, where today we cannot have economic development without getting into account a social and equitable development, and of course environment preservation and climate change mitigation. We have seen some countries, for example, who really did very well in terms of MDGs, but all of a sudden they had a natural disaster, tsunami, hurricanes, flood, and all of the sudden this ruined completely, the economy of the regions that were impacted. So therefore, we cannot think that an economic development, industrial development will be sustainable if we don't take into account the well-being of the communities, and that's the social development, the social cohesion, the social equity, the social justice, the social protection, and at the same time, of course, making sure that whatever use we do of the natural resources, it is done in respect of our environment and therefore of the future of our planet.
Those listening to your utterances will probably understand that climate change will play a very significant determining factor in the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. The World Bank just released a report stating that if there is no comprehensive agreement in Paris starting the end of this month, there will be plus 100 million poor people in the world by 2030. That should be a worry for you, right?
It is indeed, and we have very high expectations on the COP21, which is happening, as you said, in Paris this month. And we just cannot miss that opportunity. I think every day we have a clear evidence that climate change is not only a scientific study, but on the contrary, this is reality, and it's really impacting and worsening the poverty of many regions of the world and many villages and many cities. So we just cannot afford to miss this opportunity to come up with an agreement. We know it will be difficult. We know we are not yet there, but if we miss this opportunity, somehow we are just jeopardizing the future of the humanity. The most important part of the SDGs is really leaving no one behind. And if we don't address the climate change, it means that those regions which are actually climate change sensitive and fragile are going to be left behind, and they will have a chronic and cyclic floods, tsunamis, and hurricanes. And we owe them. We owe them to make sure that also their conditions and their life will be preserved, and it's really about saving lives. We have seen the tragic consequences of floods where people has to be displaced, from their villages, from their life. We have seen the tragic impact of hurricanes and tsunamis where people are dying.
The Lake Chad Basin has moved from 25,000 square kilometers of water to about 2,000 today.
Yeah. And there is more than that. So how long can we afford to do that? I don't think very long. And we have a duty vis-a-vis the next generation to really make the right decision today for us to preserve their future tomorrow.
One of the key points of the past development agenda was a global partnership for development, and developing countries usually accused the industrialized countries or the North of not doing enough in terms of technology transfer, of not doing enough in terms of debt cancellation, of not reshaping the global leadership structure, which of course has led to frustration. Is the new agenda taking all of that into consideration to have a sort of a balanced global leadership environment?
It does, definitely. It does in terms of commitment, at least, and all the countries, they committed to that.
If and only if wishes were roses.
Well, actually, no. You know me. I am a very realistic person and very down to earth when it comes to translating commitment and statement into reality. I think we need this fair partnership. But when you address a fair partnership, it means that responsibility is shared and is collective. So we need good governance on the one hand, on both hands actually, and we need also to be fair to the countries. We had some successes though. I think we see emerging countries and who really have a say, but there are still some unfair, mechanisms which actually. Because of the dependence on the aid, sometimes because of maybe unbalanced trade exchange between different countries, we are not yet there. I'm a strong believer that the solution and the measure starts at home. Before asking the others, it's important that we also internally and nationally progress is done in terms of addressing the priorities and in terms of making sure that the enabling environment actually for the industry or for the economic development or for the investment is really there. So therefore the weight of those countries is going to change.
Oh, you just said that there were a series of missing lines in the last development package. Countries and the United Nations did not see the rise of Boko Haram, did not see the rise of Islamic State, did not see the coming of the Asian tsunami, which killed so many people, did not see the rise of conflicts in Syria, the Arab Spring, all of that was not included, which means
and Ukraine,
and
the migration,
and many others. So many of those issues were not foreseen. Which means that agenda number 9 was lacking, the unpredictable point. Now you have 17. Probably the 18th point on the agenda should be the unseeable world, and resources should be allocated for that.
Well, prediction is not a human capacity. I mean, analysis is a human capacity.
The unseen. The unseeable should be the 18th point.
I mean, that we call that any other business. I think there are things we can predict, and when you think about it, many of those unforeseen events, tragic events in most of the cases, had some root causes. And when you think about the MDGs, some of the MDGs were meant actually to address some of those root causes. Poverty is a great ally to, unfortunately, to violence and to even feeding into some of the fanatism and the terrorism. So we need to keep that in mind and not kid ourselves. I mean, the root causes in not achieving MDGs, it means that we did not address completely the root causes. And breaking down the priorities and objectives into the 17th and making sure actually that peace, security and human rights and gender are cross-cutting issues and seen as really a pillar and a must for any sustainable development gain is a huge progress, but it means also a lot in terms of how can we be serious about making sure that in 2030 we would be really able to say internationally, yes, we reached them.
Okay, one of the slaps on the Millennium Development Goals was the global economic environment. Again, the world did not foresee, or those policymakers did not see the 2008 global economic crunch, which started in the United States of America, which had a lot of impact on mobilizing resources for achieving these goals. Are those concerns now well determined in the new agenda, so that in 2030 we shouldn't be apologizing like some of us are doing today?
Well, the financial crisis, the economic crisis was basically a financial crisis, and the root causes was the lack of a strong regulation of the financial system. How far have we been in improving that? I know that some progress have been made. I'm not sure we are really reaching out to the standards when it comes to a good governance of the financial system. Transparency is definitely better, and I think that all countries now are really serious about having a kind of regulation. Most probably we won't get again such crisis. But it was also a wake-up call. In many cases we were talking about globalization, but from a very, very, very narrow, actually, point of view, and through the lens of economic, exchange. Today, not only because of the financial crisis, but also because of the globalization of the terrorism, we know that our world is interlinked, and that unfortunately, if there is a problem somewhere, that will impact elsewhere. And the best example of that are definitely Islamic States and Daesh, but also the migration we see in Europe today. So again, it is very important to take very seriously those 17 goals. The 17 goals are not only, a song or just a political statement. It takes good governance. It takes monitoring. It takes accountability because we need to take stock every single time. Where do we stand and how we can readjust? But it takes also, seriously translating that into funding. Whether this funding is public budget or is aid flow, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's each country will have to deal with it. But one thing that was very important also, because of what happened, was also to put emphasis on domestic actually funding and not depending all the time on donors or on aid.
Okay. One of the words you have used in its program is good governance, transparency, accountability. I know that one of the areas of contention between the developed and the emerging countries is that most developing countries have snail work administrations. When I say the procedures are too heavy, the administration, the processing of files doesn't go faster, and so because of bureaucracy, it's very difficult to scale development and move things forward very fast. How are you going to network from a global perspective to move from up to down and from down to up with very limited time wasting and administrative bureaucracy, which of course has been like a sea of words to development?
Well, I think that the first step is first and foremost to localize, the SDGs, because now in their formulation, those are global ones. But again, we have to translate them into the reality of the country. That has to be done in a participatory approach. I mean, so we are compliant.
Let's take the case of Cameroon, for example. Yes. You just said about water, where you have so many actors involved in the water process. They will tell you of CAMEROON, they will tell you of the Ministry of, yes, of Energy and Water, they will tell you of another structure one has to distribute, like Cameroon des Eaux, the other one is I don't know what happens in that entire process.
We started already working on that before actually the SDGs, because the humanitarian situation in the far north and in the east called actually on improvement of access to water, and therefore we had to address that. But let's be realistic. We will go as far as the willingness of the government and the political will is there. We are not here to change the bureaucracy. We provide the government with the tools, with the instrument. We build the capacities. We can support the reforms, but we are not the doers when it comes to that. It takes really a very strong and firm policy and strategy in terms of reforming the bureaucracy and in terms of addressing seriously the governance issues.
Of the past, most of us saw the Millennium Development Goals from the eyes of the United Nations Development Program, which of course coordinates UN development operations across the world alongside other agencies, UNESCO, with overlapping missions. What will be the role of the UNDP, which you are representing in Cameroon in this new set of commitments for the global community?
Well, the first role again is the localization of the SDGs. In Cameroon, we are delivering as one kind of United Nations, and I have to tell you that as a resident coordinator, I'm not here to put the flag of one agency instead of another. I am the UNDP resident representative, but I think that our value added will be strengthened based on the synergies and the sum of our value added instead of coming agency by agency. Of course, each agency has its mandate and its expertise, and as UNDP, the equitable development and inclusive growth is definitely part of our priorities. Early recovery programs when it comes, to the East and Septentrion are also a priority, and goes without saying resilience and of course supporting reforms based on the request of the government again. I mean, we are not here to impose anything. Each government is sovereign, and it's up to them to decide what is their priorities, and we are here to accompany and to support the implementation of the programs to actually address those priorities for the well-being of the Cameroonian people.
Let's imagine that you or I are living in a world of 2030, and the question the journalists will put to some of us at that time, when probably I will no longer be a journalist by then, will be that, okay, In 2015, we were supposed to achieve Millennium Development Goals, so we're just 8. In 2030, we are expected to achieve Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17. Is it possible to achieve 17 development goals in 15 years when we were unable to achieve 8 development goals in 15 years within the same time framework?
I don't think that the difference is in terms of number. Actually, the 17, if you go back to the 8 MDGs, a lot of the 17s are already in the MDGs. Okay, it was more of a breakdown actually, because there was no breakdown before. Some goals were not addressed. Some
they were
priorities,
too heavy. They were packed.
Yeah, they were packed and not enough articulated in terms of indicators, in terms of monitoring, and in terms also of strategies. So this breakdown doesn't mean that there are more problems. It just means that we approach them in a different way. Again, it is the responsibility of the government to make sure they achieve that in 2030. We are hopeful in UN that will happen. Myself, I won't be in UN. I would have retired by 2030, but I would love to see a world with achieved SDGs, because that will guarantee a better world for my grandchildren.
The coordinator of the United Nations systems to Cameroon, Najat Rochdi, thanks very much for accepting our invitation on Globewatch.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks.
You're welcome.